Great. Hey, so everyone, thanks very much for joining us today. It's really much appreciated. Today's discussion is a discussion about the guiding principles on business and human rights and how these relate to the Arms Trade Treaty. As you know, as many of you will be aware, the Republic of Korea, as this year's president of the Conference of States Parties, has chosen industry as its theme. And the ATT makes it clear that that governments have a responsibility to regulate the transfer of conventional weapons. But the industry also has obligations of its own, and those are found in the guiding principles on business and human rights and include issues such as human rights due diligence. To explain all of this and much more, I'm delighted today to be joined by Florence Foster and Gerald Pouchot. Florence has worked on armed violence reduction in the Central African Republic and is now leading on the Peace and Disarmament Program at the Quaker UN office. Gerald is the managing partner of Pluto and Associates, and he has previously worked in various positions in the Swiss government and the United Nations. And most notably, he has from 2005 to 2011, Gerald served as the special advisor to the Secretary General's Special Representative on Business and Human Rights, and that was Professor John Ruggie. And in this role, he was closely involved in the development and in the drafting of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So, Gerald, let's get underway and turn to you first. Can you tell us about the guiding principles on business and human rights? How do these apply to, and what do they mean for industries engaged in arms production and transfers? Over to you, Gerald.
Yes, thank you, and hello to everybody. Sorry for being slightly late. I'm still technologically challenged. It's really a pleasure to discuss because it's one of those nice areas where we see the proverbial silos that we are always mentioning really in full effect. So very quickly, and I hope we will have a good discussion, the idea is to present very quickly the guiding principles, but more interestingly, why they were developed, what they are trying to achieve, and how they could be relevant for your discussions in armed controls. So in a nutshell, the guiding principles are a set of standards, norms, that were endorsed by the Human Rights Council in 2011. So they are not legally binding, but they are still fairly authoritative. And the fact that they were endorsed by the Human Rights Council by unanimity really strengthen their authoritative nature. For those of you who follow the Human Rights Council, they will be painfully aware that consensus is not really the modus operandi of the Council. So it really reflected a very strong endorsement. And what we have seen over the last 10, 12, 15 years almost is that they have really generated movement mostly at the domestic level on regulation. So we have laws in Germany, France, Norway, and so on and so forth that try to really address this notion of business and human rights. And what is it about? It's really stating the responsibility of business not to have a negative impact on people. So really, it's a do no harm approach, trying to set up what business should do. And the cornerstone of this whole responsibility for business is this notion of human rights due diligence. So really trying to do everything they can to prevent that their operations and activities have a negative impact on people. And if prevention doesn't work, then to try to remedy the negative impact that will have happened. So what is interesting in this setup is that it's really looking at business activities. So it includes what they do, but also the use of their products or services. So for instance, we have had a lot of discussions on the role of banks when they provide loans to bad actors and they empower them in a way to fuel human rights abuse. And you can clearly see the connection with what interests you as the role of industry. What is also interesting in the guiding principles is that, of course, we focused a lot on the responsibilities of business. And I always say responsibilities because we can't really talk about obligation because it's not legally binding and there are no international legal obligations or few legal international legal obligations that would apply directly to business. But so we focused a lot on the responsibilities of business and this concept of human rights due diligence, but the guiding principles are also focusing on the role of states. And basically here we talk about obligations because they have obligations under international and domestic laws. And it's to try to foster a human rights compliant environment for business, which means, providing support, but also regulating. Because what we know and what we have seen and something that you will also know in your own field is that most of the time, states, even though they have all those human rights obligations, don't necessarily translate those obligations to business activities. And what we have seen is that we have, for instance, export risk insurance, which is mostly something that states manage, that will give insurance to companies that will then have an absolutely abysmal human rights record. So really the idea of the guiding principle was to articulate a full universe where both states and business have their own obligation and responsibilities, and to try to make something like a coherent system. It's interesting in the field of arm transfer because at the end of the day, it's trying to address the exact same thing, which is a governance gap. If we look at the field of human rights, but same in arm control, we have plenty of treaties. Maybe less in the space of arm transfer, but still, we have this international machinery which bound states. But at the end of the day, states most of the time will be unable or unwilling to fulfill those obligations, which creates the gaps where the human rights abuse occur most of the time. So we thought that it would be particularly interesting to think about the system of the guiding principle and to project it in the arm control, because it's really trying to address the exact same challenge. We have primary actor states that have obligations that they don't fulfill, but we also have secondary actors in a way in business that have the capacity to not only commit those negative impacts, but also help avoid those impacts. And one of the examples that we have been discussing over the last few months that we have been looking at that is the example of shipping companies. Shipping companies, stuff needs to get moved from point A to point B. And of course, states, both exporting and receiving, should have all the laws, and quite often they do have the laws. Doesn't work. So the idea is really to try to use the private actor to raise their level of responsibility, to articulate clearly what is expected from them. And that's where this idea of human rights due diligence kicks in, and thereby to strengthen the whole system. So really, the guiding principles, in a way, are our plug for the governance gap that we are seeing. And because we look at human rights impact, so at the end of the day, impact on people, then it translates to all different space where ultimately we have impact on people. And we were discussing the ATT a couple of weeks ago, and the ATT is clearly an arms control treaty instrument. But if we take a step back and look at most of the provision, when I read them, I read them as a human rights concern, because we don't want the stuff to end up in the wrong hands, because when they are in the wrong hands, that will create human rights abuse. So that's where there is really this to me, full overlap between the two instruments, and how one could really foster implementation of the other. But of course, and it goes back to the first point I mentioned, we are deep into this policy silos, and people in the arms transfer world don't necessarily know about the guiding principles and how they could be useful. So really, the idea is to translate the obligations / responsibilities of one world into the other, because at the end of the day, it's really the same space. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to answer questions, and I'm sure that I wasn't clear enough, so to clarify anything that you may want to be clarified.
Hey, Gerald, thanks very much. That was an excellent start, and you very clearly set out, what the guiding principles can deliver and how these can interact with the Arms Trade Treaty. If anybody has a question and would like to raise their hand, please do, or put questions in the chat function. Gerald, in this area of business and human rights, there's much. Of course, there's much attention on the big corporations, and you said yourself that there has been movement at the domestic level in countries such as Germany and France, and you can see that big companies have an interest in demonstrating that they have a good reputation and that they are doing the right things in terms of corporate responsibility and human rights. In developing countries, and on this call, can people who are not speaking please mute their microphones? But on this call we have people based in South Sudan and Jamaica. Are the guiding principles getting traction in developing countries?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the comparative advantage of the guiding principle is, like I said, they have been endorsed by the Council by unanimity. So we avoid this Western bias or Western neo-imperialism discussion, and they are getting traction in the global South. I would say that we can make a difference between continents. It's very strong in Latin America, a little bit less, but still well considered in Africa, for instance, with Ghana, South Africa as really committed. And we still need to work a lot on Asia. It's true that if we look at the spectrum of activities, Asia is probably lagging a bit behind. What is interesting, though, is that many of the concepts, and mostly this idea of human rights due diligence, is percolating everywhere. And for instance, even China a couple of years ago produced some guidelines for their companies operating in Africa, and other way with China. They don't take international standards, but they want to develop their own. But what we saw was a very strong alignment. So that's the kind of movement that we see. And your question was twofold. It was one on the geographical scope, but also on the size of companies. And here, of course, the larger companies are the most involved, and the smaller one less so. I don't necessarily see that as a problem for two reasons. One, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, large companies mean large impact. So
Yeah.
I have no problem focusing on those. One. Two, what is interesting in the construction of the normative framework of the guiding principle is that it's really a value chain approach. So even if you are a small company, at some point you will have a business relationship with a larger company. And the whole idea is to use the leverage of big companies to project those norms to smaller companies. So if you want to do business with us, you have to follow those standards. And that's where I think the system that the guiding principles put on the table is fairly interesting, because it tries to avoid one of the big challenge, which is the legalization of norm. I don't want to get too academic here, but a real fact is that when we try just to legalize and not having the standard, then we lose opportunities. Because if, and I will go back to my shipping company, if a big shipping company requires a level of due diligence to its partner, even though it won't be legally binding, it can well be fairly effective. And effectiveness is what I'm after at the end of the day. But it's true. It's true that smaller companies definitely fly under the radar. It's true that the guiding principles won't be the right instrument to nail bad actors, but that's just a fact of life.
Yeah. Hey, Gerald, we've got a question in the chat function, and it's from Cesar, who's based in the Philippines. And he's asking about, if I understand the question correctly, are businesses understanding their responsibilities in the context of conflicts?
Could you reframe that? Because I'm not sure I understand.
With what I think, Cesar, I don't know if you want to speak to your question. I understand the question is, when different industries are operating in a situation of an armed conflict, do they understand what their responsibilities are in terms of human rights and not doing any further harm?
Yes, so that's definitely a work in progress. I've been in this field for a long time, and for that long time, we couldn't even have a discussion with most companies. Oh, we just respect domestic laws and that's fine. Now we are seeing this emergence of and realization that they have this broader set of responsibilities, and particularly in conflict situations, because the impacts, the violations are really serious. So we are seeing development. We are definitely not there yet. And I just saw the questions. In terms of capacities, what we are seeing is that more companies, and by far not all companies, but more companies are trying to implement this concept of human rights due diligence. So looking at the impact of their activities on people. And they do that for a few reasons. One is what you mentioned with the reputation aspect, but to me, it's by far not the most important. A key leverage is in the financial sector, because with the ESG discussion, more and more banks are requiring their clients to run this kind of due diligence and impact assessment, because it's a risk. And they are factoring the human rights or people's risk more and more. Again, not there yet, but when it's not that old of a discussion. And I know of a very large French companies active in the airplane business that is looking at this very seriously, developing their capacity and identifying a whole new set of risks. The reality is also that within companies there is a fight going on between those who are old school, bottom line, let's sell as much as we can, and those who are a bit more modern in their approach and looking a bit more down the line. But like I said, the leverage to put pressure on business are definitely increasing, both on the financial side and also on the regulatory side.
Yeah.
The challenge, the challenge in the space will be to make both companies and state realize that what they are asking today is most of the time not the right questions, and the due diligence and the licensing process in most states is mostly misplaced. I'm not saying that we will overcome the purely political decision. You will sell to that customer because it fits our foreign policy.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I think that what we can really develop and push for is to have a much more serious due diligence process that highlights the risks. And then you take your decision, but based on a full understanding of the risk. And we see that evolving in a nice way, as always, not fast enough. I hope, Cesar, that it responds to your question.
I think so. Cesar, I'm assuming that because you put your hand back down that you're satisfied with this answer, that you are a satisfied customer here.
Yeah, if I can just add a little bit, our experience in the Philippines is if you want to make business responsible by being human rights and conflict sensitive, you have to have some capacities intervene, like we did the one for a bank. That because usually banks and business are sweeps all this under the rug of risk assessment, but risk assessment with no framework for human rights and conflict sensitivity. So they think they're doing it, but they in reality they're not doing it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Cesar. Jeff, I saw that you had your hand up. Do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thanks. Hi, Gerald. I'm Jeff Abramson. I'm based in the United States. Great to have you here for this. I've been following this issue for a couple of years, so I'm not as long as many others, but I find it a great avenue to try to encourage responsibility besides through the treaty itself, which I do think the links. In the United States, there's a huge backlash against ESG right now. And so I'm wondering what you find to be the most persuasive arguments for, business and human rights due diligence, what you find when you make this argument. And then I had a second question, which is, imagine you've seen last year, the American Bar Association put out a sort of brief on the arms industry and human rights due diligence. And I'm wondering if you had a chance to look at that and what you think it's done well, or what we might be able to add to the arguments there, if that makes sense. Thanks.
Yes, well, thank you for the early start. But on your first question, I think that it's a very interesting discussion, but it's also on ESG and the pushback against ESG. It's so politicized that I'm wondering if there is any serious leg behind it. And by that, I mean lots of smoke, but is there an actual pushback? Because when you see the numbers actually on sustainable investment writ large, and most of sustainable investment are so poorly defined that they shouldn't qualify. Nonetheless, they still have the tide. You don't see any reduction in amount. You don't see the providers, so the banks mostly, diminishing their offering, and you don't see any of the big insurance companies, for instance, coming back on environmental and social risks. So it seems, and I hope I'm not wrong, it seems to be a part of this cultural war that you are having now in the US, and it's a big target, but I doubt that there is any serious fire behind it. Even more so that when you read the arguments that are used, they are either not new, because it's the whole shareholder theory that we have seen for the last 50 years, or they are completely missing the mark because they are thinking about something that is completely different. And I think that, and that's where, again, the guiding principles are useful, because they frame the discussion on do no harm. And I think that the discussion is much easier when you frame it that way. So we don't want what you do to hurt people, rather than trying to transform companies in woke champions. And so meaning that they have to advocate for different societal issues. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying that it puts you in a much more difficult in the discussion. So by going to international standards, even though American people don't like international standards, I think it clarifies and it can appease the discussion, even more so that most of those companies will have international exposure, so they will have to continue this discussion, because if they want to access the European market, in a couple of years, they will have to have this human rights due diligence in place, and so on and so forth. So I think that we need to fight this fight, but we shouldn't overemphasize this fight for what we want to accomplish. On the ABA guidance, it's a very interesting initiative. I think it's good. It's substantively good, but it's geared for a US audience in a US context. So most of it is, how should I lobby Congress? So the principles are there, and the intent is perfect. I think we need to work on it if we want to internationalize it, and also to make it more relevant for business. Because at the end of the day, now I'm one of those consultants, and one set of clients I never take on the corporate side is those who come to me and say, oh, I want to save the world. That's a red flag to me. They need to run a business, and that's fine. So they need to minimize their risks. And so we need to really make them realize that there are a set of risks, even if you are in the gun business, that you don't assess right, and that will hurt your business. And I think that we can have some serious discussion. And the ABA document is a useful first step in that direction. But we need to I think it's much more a framing issue than a substance issue. And it would be great if we can work on that a little bit more.
Hey, Gerald, thanks very much for that. The challenge that we face is really how to bring together this issue of corporate responsibility and government responsibility. As I said at the beginning, under the ATT, it is governments who are clearly responsible for regulating arms transfers. But how to tie this in with corporate responsibility, and really to do so in a way that, if possible, is collaborative. And, a challenge in this area is that we are dealing with industries that have a very close and a very privileged relationship with their governments. And their main clients will be their national governments. So this makes the relationship an even closer one. In this context, how do you frame human rights due diligence as a benefit to these companies?
Yeah, it's the two questions are linked actually, because when we started the guiding principles, we had exactly the same type of argument. The norms apply to states. They were developed by states for states, which is true. But when you look at the actual implementation, you realize that, like I said earlier, that you have other actors that have a huge role in that successful implementation. And we have to make a leap of faith and assume that those states, governments, want to fulfill their obligation in good faith. So that they have an interest to have the most effective implementation. And the whole idea, and I think that we need to see this, we don't need to develop it, it exists, is this set of different responsibilities for business that belong to the same space as the state obligation. So it's really part of the same normative world, but differentiated because of the actor. So that's the intellectual response. The practical response is that there is a real challenge in this symbiotic relationship between companies and government. What I have found useful is simply to remind companies that when something will go wrong, they will be the one left out to dry. And that's the sad reality of it, because if there is a campaign, you will target the state, but you will also target the companies, and the companies will have absolutely nothing to defend themselves. If you combine that, and we have seen that already, with this push from insurer and the financial system, then they have an incentive to look beyond simply responding to their main client. But it is a challenge. It is a challenge.
Yeah.
But I think that to highlight that they have on the same product, they have a different set of risks that will potentially hurt them is extremely important. And also, I think that we really need to see arm transfer in its value chain dimension, because I think that it will be, at first, it will be difficult to really move a company that does just arms. If they do just that, and they have their DoD contracts and so on and so forth, extremely difficult. But there are not so many companies that don't belong to a conglomerate and do other things than arms. And that's looking at the producer. And then, like we discussed before, stuff needs to be moved around. So if, your transporter require one way or the other, the producer to have a certain level of due diligence, then we are in a different discussion, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that. We have a question from Sarah San Martin, and Sarah, I don't know if you want to speak. Actually, I'm not entirely sure if I understand your question. So, Sarah, do you want to say something at this moment? Sarah, are you still with us? Sarah, I can see you.
Sorry. Yes,
okay.
yes. Sorry, I didn't find the phone. Yes, maybe it's very personal question, and if you don't want to answer, Gerald, it's no problem. But how you start in your life, in your experience, to have this consciousness about the responsibility and the human rights, no, and that we are a global humanity, no?
Yeah, that's how long do we have? That's a fairly deep question, but well, the sad answer is that I'm, at the end of the day, I'm a technocrat, and I like to find to try to find or to contribute to finding solution to things that work or don't work so well. So that's how I embarked on this. When I started, I was with the Swiss Foreign Affairs and the Human Rights Division, and we were thinking about ways to improve what we were doing, and this business angle was definitely underexploited. But my boss at the time said something that I always kept with me: is that when our minister goes somewhere, she was a woman at the time, she will see her counterpart. If the CEO of Nestle, a very large Swiss company, goes somewhere, he has the president on speed dial. And we need to leverage that.
That's a good response. And Gerald, there's no shame in being a technocrat. Many of us have started in that role. Hey, Liz Kirkman, I can see you've got your hand up. Over to you, Liz.
Hi, thanks. This is really interesting. I mean, I've been involved in some discussions a couple of years ago, but so it's really good to come back and revisit this. It's particularly in the ATT context. And I mean, just going back to what you were saying earlier, Gerald, about arms. I mean, arms manufacturers and arms traders are going to be the most difficult, I think, in terms of us being able to persuade them to undertake human rights due diligence, etc., because it almost seems sort of oxymoronic, an arms manufacturing company having a human rights policy, etc. It seems, there seems to be a bit of a tension there that I think means that they are going to be the most difficult sector for us to kind of, push these ideas out. And so I was just wondering about, obviously there are a whole range of companies, that make sort of dual use technologies, for example, and governments do outreach. A lot of governments do outreach to these companies, encouraging them to develop their own internal compliance programs, to make sure that they are export control compliant. And the US, I mean, they've got a massive program that focuses on this, encouraging companies to be aware of who they're doing business with, whether these people are sanctioned, is there a risk of diversion, etc. And I just wondered whether, if we could get the human rights element into those discussions, that would, really kind of, especially if you get the US, I mean, they tend to be the kind of, they do it first and then everyone else kind of follows. And I just wondered whether if there's a possibility to kind of to have conversation with US authorities and the Bureau of Industry and Security and the Department of Commerce are the people who do a lot of this outreach, and just kind of, try and get some kind of leverage there in terms of, integrating human rights due diligence into the other assessments that they do, in relation to who they're doing business with and what might happen to the goods and technologies once they're exported. And then once you kind of build that up, then you almost have, you could end up in a situation where the arms manufacturers, the like full arms manufacturers are isolated, and they're the outliers rather than the people who do the human rights due diligence being the outliers. So it would be great to kind of like think about how we might get to that situation, and who we might, engage in order to do that. Thanks.
No, absolutely. I think you are absolutely right. We don't need, what is interesting is when you look at it in human rights due diligence, scare a lot of people. It scales business, but also it scales people in government, because the people in government dealing with transfer are not the human rights people. So they have no clue, and they see that as a big scary thing. But actually, when you can demonstrate what it really means, and that it's a risk assessment that they already know. That's why we use the term due diligence in the guiding principles, because we hope it would resonate with business doing a lot of due diligence on a lot of things. When you can actually articulate what it really means and how it could be plugged in existing compliance program, and for instance, anti-corruption is also a space that we can leverage much more. It's definitely the right strategy. Now, the challenge with the US, just like with most other governments, is precisely this siloed approach, and the human rights people don't deal with the disarmament or armed controls people. So if we can, from the outside, create those bridges, I think it can be extremely helpful, because most of the time when we can show what it means and we can move people past their instinctive fear of human rights, then the discussion is usually quite fruitful. And what is interesting in the case of the US is that state has produced a few guidance based on the guiding principles for different sectors. And they have now, after a bit of flux, they seem to have now a good team back in place. The challenge, and I know that because when I was with the Swiss, it was the same thing, is that it's not so easy to reach your colleagues on the other side of the house. And that's, I think, where external pressure or invitation to speak to each other can be very useful. But it would definitely be a very good way to move ahead.
Liz and Gerald, Liz, thanks for that question. Gerald, we have on the call, we have different Control Arms Coalition members who are out in the field working on these issues each and every day, and often talking to their governments, talking to ministers, talking to officials. What would be your message to the Control Arms Coalition members as to what they can do in their everyday work to support the guiding principles?
I mean, it's not so much about supporting the guiding principles, it's supporting themselves, but using the guiding principles as an authoritative, something that the counterparts that they talk to has probably endorsed, as a tool to improve whatever it is that they want to do. Because I guess that people in your coalition won't speak to the worst governments because they have no interest in that. But those who enter in dialogue, we can at least assume, even if it's fake, but we can leverage that they want to move in the right direction. And you talk about diversion. Well, here is a set of principles that we could use to limit the risk of diversion, because the result of diversion is human rights violation. So really, to be aware of, for the members of your coalition, to be aware of the guiding principles and what they offer. And I think that we need to probably produce a short brief, something that could be distributed, just to make most of your members, or as many of your members as possible, of the instrument and what are the key requirements. And basically, the key requirement is for business to know what their products will be used wherever along the supply chain. and they need to be able to demonstrate that they have had a look at that.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Gerald. Florence, we're going to now turn to you. Florence, at the Human Rights Council, and I know that's where much of your attention is focused, often this area of business and human rights is the poor cousin to civil and political rights. And it's not the issue necessarily championed by Western countries or an issue that dominates the debate. But I would be interested to hear from you, Florence. Is there increasing attention to business and human rights, and also to the arms industry at the Human Rights Council? Over to you, Florence.
Thanks. So I'm not sure I can answer the question on the attention to business writ large. I think that's one that perhaps Gerald has a better insight on when it comes to looking at the trajectory. Certainly when you look at arms-related impacts to human rights, there's an increasing attention and a recognition that this is a Human Rights Council issue, which was not necessarily the case about a decade ago, where the silos were really quite marked. And some of that changed in part because of two Human Rights Council resolutions, one on transfers and one on acquisitions by civilians of firearms, which really put a peg in the sand when it comes to it being an issue for the Human Rights Council. And the collateral of that has been that this topic has been taken up in different country-based resolutions by different treaty bodies that look at specific treaty implementation by some member states, but also by the Business and Human Rights Working Group in the conflict project that they took up in late 2019. So I think that trickle effect is coming, and with that also looking at the arms industry as a specific subsection of business. Now, one of the things that we have seen, though, is in those resolutions, and in particular in the last resolution on acquisitions by civilians, there is still a narrative that tends to slip when we talk about business, where the complementary responsibilities and obligations are fudged. And I don't have a better word for that, but there's this gray zone or narrative that's created where there's a tendency to say it's one or the other that has the responsibilities ultimately, whereas the UN Guiding Principles argues that it's both states and the private sector. And that comes down to, talking about technocracy, looking at the finite wording in resolutions, but it's also important because it is not one or the other, it's both. So I think that's where still some delegates and those who make and shape some of the policies in Geneva at the Human Rights Council also need to be upheld when it comes to continuing to ensure that the guiding principles standards is maintained in whatever is produced and reproduced in either analysis, resolutions, or follow-ups and reviews to some of these treaties. So I think that looking at that governance gap when it comes to business is something that's of interest. Now, our interest is specifically on the arms sector, and that is increasing. And organizations like the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is part of that movement of trying to submit their own reports when they can, when it comes to country situations. And I think I would encourage anybody on this call to include as much as possible arms-related risks analysis if they are submitting to any reviews of member states, either under the Universal Periodic Review, under different treaty bodies, but also engaging with special procedures. So these different mandate holders that look at different rights and go to countries, and relating those rights to arms-related risk would be important. So for instance, the special rapporteur on counterterrorism would be one point in question where she has been looking at technological transfers in relation to counterterrorism, which might be an area where we could have collectively engaged when it comes to the private sector's responsibility with that mandate as a Human Rights Council mandate holder. So I think there are different ways to be able to continue increasing that and closing that loop, and creating more evidence-based when it comes to those complementary parallel responsibilities of states and private sector.
Thanks very much, Florence. Hey, now, are there any final questions that anyone has? We've got a moment right now for final questions. You're most welcome to put your hand up. Hey, Florence, I wanted to ask you, I know CUNO was really closely involved in the early days of negotiating and then implementing the Convention on Anti-Personnel Mines. This was under your predecessor, David Attwood. How did the work in CUNO kind of go from very much a pure approach on control arms to this governance gap that you've identified between human rights and disarmament and arms control?
It's an interesting question. So for starters, the work that David did was he narrates it that way. This is not my critique or my assessment of it. It's serendipity when it comes to the anti-personnel mine, right? There was a huge coalition at the time that was actively lobbying, and it happened that CUNO was at the right place at the right time and had the right tools to put together a group of member states that then took it public. I guess we've always been the glad foster parent of orphaned issues, and looking at where there are small changes in the system that need to be made, and in this case, you know, a gaping hole in it when it comes to the governance gap here. We have this lucky factor of we're very small, so our resources are stretched thin, but it does mean we are pushed to work closely with our colleagues who work on different issues. So I have a colleague who works only on human rights issues, another one only on climate change issues, and another one on economic systems. And by virtue of the smallness of our team, we're able to glean and collaborate across programs, which really helps us understand different worlds. And I think that's been really the key factor of being able to reach different communities of practice and see where some of some of those governance gaps are and where we can help address them. So that's how we've slipped. But I think, you know, in David Attwood's work, the link between arms-related risk and the impact on human rights and development was there. The Geneva Declaration was really foundational to a lot of the work that he did. And that sort of moves forward when you talk about the SDGs and the whole looking at the private sector's involvement. And our concern is around social justice, so has always been looking quite skeptically at what the private sector can do, considering its modus operandi is to make money and not to make peace, so to speak. So I think that's always been our huge question mark when some of these evolutions have happened, and therefore always looked at the private sector, you know, with a little bit of healthy skepticism, but also when the guiding principles came out, and now with these discussion around private sector responsibilities in different parts, so including the arms industry, is to be able to question that in a healthy way, but also suggest ways forward. And I think that's where we saw that we had potentially a role being able to do that. I don't know if that answers your question, but it would be a question for David as well.
Thanks very much. Hey, well, we're at the end of our time. We have this next up as a Stimson and SIPRI event on the state of arms transfers. So I'm going to return to Gerald for the last word. Gerald, we've received news that the Italian courts have rejected a case against the arms industry, and you know, you attended the first lot of ATT working groups this year, where there was considerable resistance to this issue of human rights due diligence. But Gerald, do you believe that there is hope, and if so, why?
Well, if we don't believe there is hope, we need to do something else. Like I always told my younger colleagues when they were joining, you know, what we do is watching crowds grow. But when I see the progress we have made over the last 10 or 15 years on business and human rights writ large, it's source for optimism. If you compare, you know, the international time is slow. But when you see, I mean, there is 10 years between new norms, not binding, new norms being established and found law at the domestic level. That's fairly fast. So I think it's a reason for optimism, even though it's never fast enough. And yes, we see this court decisions, but the courts, are usually fairly conservative, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But when we see the development around the EU directive, and last week or this week, there was this call to make sure that the arms sector is involved in the scope. I think we will see some serious movement. If you want to be very cynical, I think that this increased the pressure on the industry writ large to simply react and so to start discussing. And so that's why I think we have a moment, we have a policy opening that we should try to leverage as much as possible. And I'll finish on that because I think you all have an event. But the ATT working group was a UN working group, so it was fairly lame. But I was fairly optimistic because the pushback is more out of ignorance than out of a grand political strategy for most delegations. But for some, it's a bit more complicated. But I think that there is definitely something to work with.
Yeah. Thanks very much. I know that Edward, you've come in with a question. What are the links between private security companies and firearms use, and human rights? The issue of private security companies. I think this is the subject of a potentially a new instrument, but private security companies are coming under increasing attention also at the Human Rights Council. So this is also an issue that's worth watching. But time is unfortunately limited today. I want to say a really big thanks to Gerald and to Florence for joining us. It's been very insightful, and I really hope it's been useful for coalition members who have joined us today. This is only the start of a continuing discussion, especially this year, and one where we really have to really have to build our knowledge and get out there and advocate in support of the guiding principles. So thanks very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy the next event for those who will be joining it. So thanks again and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, NY. Thank you for bringing us together. Bye.
Bye-bye. Adios.
Bye.
You're ready.
Bye.
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 Ciao, ciao.